This is not your typical how to play Tenpai or how to beat Tenpai guide that you'll find in other videos on YouTube. I've been playing Tenpai pretty much since it's been released in the TCG, and I think there are a few things I want to share now that Tenpai is becoming very prevalent in both the TCG and Master Duel. So whether you're playing the deck or trying to pick up a few new ways to beat the deck, I guarantee that you'll learn something new from this video. So even though Tenpai is a deck that's infamous for things like Shifter, board clears like Raigeki, Harpies, and Feather Duster, and then seeing one card combos, I feel like there's some intricacies that are worth talking about in this deck. And I'm going to put them up on the screen right now so you can go ahead and use the timestamps in the pinned comment below to skip ahead to the sections that interest you the most. With all that being said, let's get into the very first section. So in the very first section, I'm going to be talking about what Tenpai will try to do when going first, as well as some of the times that Tenpai will choose to go first. So if you're playing against the deck, you can have a better idea of when your Tenpai opponent may choose to actually go first post-siding. This is a pretty important mind game that the Tenpai player gets to play. So starting off with what Tenpai will try to do when going first. From my experience, when Tenpai goes first, their main goal is to essentially just set up a floodgate to make it so your opponent can't play. If you think about their typical end board, it's just going to be some hand traps and Heraldic Seals and a way to OGK on the next turn, but that usually isn't going to be enough against most competent decks in the meta, which is why they have to play cards like Floodgates. And in the current format, Power Filter is one of those strong floodgates that Tenpai will choose to play when going first, and they will side it in whenever they decide to go first against a deck that loses to this card. Now, aside from Floodgates, something that's also important to talk about is Heraldic Seals. Not for its effect to return to hand, but for the monsters that it's summoning, because Tenpai will try to take full advantage of the monster that it summons off of Heraldic Seals, and there are quite a few options that I want to go over. Perhaps the most prevalent one that you're going to see is Quackimiru Drago. Essentially, Quackimiru Drago is a floodgate for light and dark decks, and this will just give Tenpai essentially a searchable way to flood out some of the best decks like Yubel and Branded in the meta. This is something that you definitely need to watch out for. If you're going up against Tenpai and you're playing one of those decks, it's very possible your opponent will simply just choose to go first, put this in their main deck, and try to flood you out with it. As someone playing against Tenpai, you probably just want to save your Ash Blossom for Heraldic Seals effect to summon from the deck, as opposed to trying to stop them on their very first turn when they try to set it up, because any extender will just blow past the Ash Blossom anyways, and they'll set up Seals, and you won't be able to get a Drago. Something to keep in mind as a Tenpai player when you have Seals and a card like Kaiman is that you can actually chain block the Seals effect to summon from deck, and that's very important when you're trying to resolve its effect to summon out a floodgate like Quackimiru Drago. Essentially what you would do is just activate the effect to bounce a card back to the hand, chain Kaiman. Kaiman is going to allow you to add Genroku, and in a new chain, since Heraldic Seals is a mandatory effect to summon from deck, it'll be Chain Link 1, Genroku will be Chain Link 2 to summon from hand, and now your opponent can't Ash Blossom your Heraldic Seals, which is just very important when you're trying to either get follow-up or bringing out that floodgate monster out onto the field like Quackimiru Drago. So getting back to some of the other dragons that Tenpai can choose to summon off of Heraldic Seals, the next most popular one you're going to see is Grand Tusk Dragon, and Grand Tusk Dragon is essentially just for any other matchup that isn't light or dark, because what it does on summon, it destroys up to 2 cards your opponent controls, which is pretty strong against pretty much everything, and it just makes it so Seals now is able to essentially remove 3 cards on the field, which is very important when Tenpai's only end board piece is essentially always going to be Heraldic Seals. So this is something you should watch out for when your Tenpai opponent goes first, and you're not playing a light or dark deck. This is probably the target that they're going to summon out. Even though those are the main disruption monsters that Tenpai will summon off of Seals, there are also a few other Seals targets I want to go through quickly, just so you understand what the Tenpai player is trying to accomplish in each of those scenarios. If the Tenpai player summons something like Pydra or Magnemite, they're just trying to go for follow-up because they think that either you're not going to be able to kill them that turn, or their hand traps are going to be able to stop you from setting up too big of a board. Tenpai can also summon a card like Fadra, and this is more common in the battle phase where Fadra will bring back a Chandra, and then they will attempt to synchro summon some level 7, and then maybe climb up to Transcendent Dragion or something to force all your guys to attack. But in the battle phase, the one that you can probably expect the most and have to watch out for is Fadra, because once you're in the battle phase, all their effects to synchro are alive, so they can start disrupting you with their synchro plays from there. And then finally, the last target that I want to talk about is Bystial Druisworm. This isn't a very common target that you're going to see be summoned, but I think it's important to be aware of the possibility that it's there, because when your Tenpai opponent chooses to summon this, from my experience at least, it would be to give an additional disruption off of a card like Forbidden Droplet, where they send Druisworm for cost, negate something, and then send something else. Or if it's in the battle phase and they have a Chandra, they can attempt to synchro summon away using the Chandra and the Druid's Worm, and then Druid's Worm can send something else on the field. So hopefully now you're a little bit more familiar with what Hermetic Seals is going to be able to summon when Tenpai goes first. I think these are probably going to cover pretty much every single relevant target that's going to be summoned off of Seals. So now you know when you're playing against Tenpai, this is some of the stuff that you can expect in different types of situations. Now for the next part of this section, I want to talk about when Tenpai Dragon's actually going to go first. So this can be some tips for if you're a Tenpai player, when you should be choosing to go first, or if you're playing against Tenpai, you can make a better read on your opponent in a game 2 or game 3 situation. Now from my experience, the times I will choose to go first are one, obviously against decks that are like FTKs, so things like Branded or things like Gimmick Puppet back in the day, because if you don't see a hand trap, they're going to set up a board that you can't use board breakers on. And against those types of decks, you'd rather just go first and not try to play the mini game of do I draw enough hand traps to stop my opponent's combo hand. The other time I would choose to go first is when I have floodgates that are very good in a specific matchup. So using Power Filter as an example, this card is very good against both Snake Eyes and Yubel. So against those matchups, I will simply just choose to go first, activate this card, and essentially tell my opponent if they don't have an out, they're not going to be able to play. This is especially prevalent if they're playing Yubel, because there are 2 floodgates now that hit that deck very hard. So if you're playing a deck like that will lose to a common floodgate like Quackmire Drago or Power Filter, you can reasonably predict your Tenpai opponent to choose to go first, and you can side accordingly and play cards like Cosmic Cyclone to out floodgates, for example, or play cards to out Quackmire Drago like Forbidden Droplets. And then finally, the last case when Tenpai is going to go first, every time in the mirror match, the person who lost is pretty much always going to make their opponent go first. Pretty obvious, but I think it's just something good to know because there isn't really a good reason for Tenpai to actually go first. So now that you're familiar with both what the Tenpai deck does when going first, as well as when they'll choose to go first, hopefully you'll feel more comfortable going up into this matchup post-siding and allow you to make better judgment calls as to when your opponent will choose to go first, and hopefully side accordingly in order to beat them.
In this next section, I just wanted to talk about Dimensional Barrier, since it's one of the most commonly played cards against Tenpai. Yes, Threatening Roar is another option, but there isn't really much to talk about there since it pretty much shuts out Tenpai's entire turn. But with Dimensional Barrier, there are a few things that Tenpai can do, so I wanted to make sure that you were aware of it, whether you're trying to play the deck or choosing to play Dimensional Barrier against this deck. And for the very first option, it's just going to be very simply the Raging Phoenix and Zelantis OTK. So to do this OTK, essentially, you just somehow get 4 bodies out onto the board, or you get into any situation where you have access to Princess, and plus another monster on field, and then Princess is going to bring back a monster, and then from here you're just going to turn these 2 monsters into the copy of Raging Phoenix, and then from here go into Zelantis. Not much to really say about this combo. You've probably seen this in other decks as well. It works the same way in here. Essentially you just use Zelantis, summon back your monster, summon back their monster, and then from here special summon back Princess, pop their monster and your own monster, and then from there you get your Raging Phoenix back, which is then going to be over 8,000 points of damage. Now this is a pretty simple combo and one of the options that Tenpai has, but I don't think every list is playing this, and I personally wouldn't play it either because I feel like the conditions for this to work are just so specific. Like, you would very specifically need to have forced your opponent to use barrier first. So like you have something like Lightning Storm or Harpy's Feather Duster, and then from there they have to have a monster on the board, and then plus you need to put out a couple of bodies out onto the board to even get to this position in the first place. So I personally don't really like this combo, but it is one of the options that Tenpai has, so just be aware if you have Dimensional Barrier and don't really have much of a board behind it, this is something that they can do in order to OTK. So let's move on to the next thing that they can do. So for the next thing that Tenpai can do, it's going to be a bit simpler. You only need access to essentially 3 bodies out onto the board. You would get it out usually through Pydra searching Kaiman and then Chandra summoning itself. And then you would simply just link it to Doolittle Chimera. And Doolittle Chimera, essentially what it does is all fire monsters on the field are going to gain 500 attack and defense. And it's important to make this not only because it makes your small guys like a little bit bigger to help you push for game, but it also puts monsters into the graveyard, which is important to push for more damage with the card like Fadra. So at this point, you just simply go battle phase, and then from there, hit with the Doolittle Chimera, activate the Kaiman, bring out Chandra. Chandra is going to use its effect after it attacks to summon out a copy of Fadra. Here I made a little mistake. Chandra should be 2000 because it is giving all fire monsters a 500 attack and defense. But regardless, the point is you essentially just make this first and then just kill your opponent without ever having to go into your synchro part of your extra deck. Now, I think that this combo is a little bit more accessible. It doesn't require as much as the Princess combo because your opponent doesn't necessarily have to have a monster on field and you don't have to put as many bodies out onto the board. But the thing with this combo as well, just like the other Princess one, is that this is assuming that your opponent will have no monsters on the field, so all these attacks will go through directly. Plus, you also have to force your opponent to use Dimensional Barrier early before you enter your battle phase. So you would once again need to have something like Harpy's Feather Duster or Lightning Storm. I don't really like this combo either. And personally, when I played the deck, I never played any of these combos in my list because I felt like the conditions to use them were just not right, especially since I wasn't playing cards like Raigeki and the board breakers like Lightning Storm and Feather Duster. So those two are the most common combos that you're going to see Tenpai try to do. So do keep in mind, if you do side in Dimensional Barrier against this deck, you want to make sure you at least have something on your board, even if it's just a monster, because it'll stop something like this. And if you have something like an extra hand trap, you'll probably be able to prevent your opponent from getting access to the Raging Phoenix Atlantis line. For the next part, I'm going to show what you can do when they actually Dimensional Barrier you in the battle phase. So for this last section, I want to go over what happens when Dimensional Barrier gets used during the battle phase. I think this is probably the most realistic assumption because most of the time Dimensional Barrier isn't going to be flipped unless your opponent threatens to make a synchro in the battle phase or somehow makes a synchro in main phase 1, but usually that doesn't happen unless you have the field spell. So most of the time, this is going to be the most common case that you come across. So for this part, we're just going to assume the Tenpai player just has some standard stuff, so like Pydra, searching Kaiman, and then summoning out Chandra. Assuming we go straight battle phase, our opponent's going to activate the Dimensional Barrier at the start of the battle phase. I think you don't necessarily have to chain it to make anything. You can, but either way, it shouldn't be enough to kill your opponent if they're on full life points. In this specific case, we're just going to assume that we just get a bunch of attacks off and then try to do stuff in main phase 2. So after we've attacked with our monsters, we'll summon out a random body out onto the board. And something that we can do from here is continue to put more bodies on the board during the battle phase with Kaiman, which I think is important. At this point, once you've gotten hit with Dimensional Barrier, you don't necessarily want to burn a card like Vajra for no reason because you're not going to be able to trigger its effect this turn anyways, since you won't be able to put stuff in the graveyard and then attack with it afterwards. Using the Kaiman to grab a random extra body out from your deck during the battle phase is good enough because we're just going to use this in main phase 2 for some link plays. So after attacking with everything, you would just go main phase 2, and then in main phase 2, this is pretty much what Tenpai is going to go for. If they get hit by Barrier at the start of the battle phase, they will just turn 2 of their monsters into seals in the extra monster zone, which is follow-up plus an additional disruption. And then if they play Striker Dragon, they can make Striker Dragon and then SP Little Knight. So I wanted to show this because I think that this is probably the most realistic case that you're going to come across when you choose to side in Dimensional Barrier and when you play Tenpai. Because what's going to happen is you might get hand trapped a couple of times by Tenpai. You don't really end on much of a board. They're just going to go battle phase with their guys, expecting to just win from there. You activate Barrier at the start of the battle phase, and then from there, they just put about a bunch of bodies on board by battling, and then go main phase 2 and sort of just make these two. This is probably what you're going to see the most because these two are played in pretty much every single Tenpai extra deck, and you don't really have to fulfill any crazy conditions like drawing Feather Duster or Lightning Storm and forcing Dimensional Barrier early. If you're choosing to side in Dimensional Barrier and either not putting up much of a board or just not putting up a board at all, this is kind of what you can expect to deal with at most against Tenpai. It would just be a SP Little Knight banish on summon, 1 on your turn, and then plus seals, a bounce, and follow-up. So I hope this section was helpful to you, whether you're choosing to side Dimensional Barrier or whether you're choosing to play Tenpai. Hopefully I gave you some things to consider in this very common situation that you'll come across as long as Tenpai is one of the meta decks. In this next section, I want to go over a somewhat common scenario you might come across when playing Tenpai in a Tenpai mirror match. This section is a little bit more targeted towards Tenpai players, but I think that even as a non-Tenpai player, you can still benefit from going through this example by understanding what the Tenpai player is trying to accomplish and what are some of the things that you should consider when you're trying to defend yourself against Tenpai. Plus, this example is going to go over some things that Tenpai can do in main phase 2 after having not killed in the battle phase. This is going to offer some pretty important insight into the abilities of the Tenpai deck when it isn't able to successfully OTK. And I think that this situation is more common than you might expect, because even outside the mirror match against a deck like Yubel, they could have monsters that can't be destroyed by battle, etc, etc. And then you would have to go through a similar situation where you have to consider breaking your opponent's board and then setting something up main phase 2 if you're not able to kill them. In this example situation, our opponent has ended on a Hermetic Seals. We forced it out somehow, and our opponent has summoned a Chandra from their deck in defense position with 0 attack and 0 defense. And then our last card is a Tenpai Dragon Chandra. Plus, our opponent has a Pydra in the graveyard that they used on their turn 1 to set up the Seals play. Now, what we'll do is just enter the battle phase, attack with the Chandra. Both Chandras are going to activate. Our opponent's very obviously just going to summon out Phaedra from their deck so their Chandra doesn't die. Plus, it gets them an extra body and follow-up. And as the Tenpai player with just a single Chandra, you would just simply summon out Pydra. Both the Pydra and the Phaedra effects would trigger. And now we get into a somewhat common situation because our opponent has the ability to synchro during our battle phase, and so do we. So at this point, as the turn player who only has 2 monsters right now, you can probably recognize that this is a situation that you're not going to be able to OTK your opponent under. Not only because they have Phaedra, but they also have the ability to synchro during your battle phase. But the way to navigate around that situation is to always use your synchro effects with turn player priority. You want to make sure that your synchro effects are chain link 1, and the reason for that is because it then forces your opponent to chain their monsters on top. Otherwise, you can just make something like Transcendent Dragon or Meteor Burst Dragon and make it so that they can't do anything during the rest of the battle phase, and then they will most likely lose from there. Plus, being chain link 1 for synchroing means your opponent gives you information first on what they're summoning. Since they will be chain link 2 or higher, they'll summon the monster first. In this case, there are a few different things that can happen after we've used our effective synchro as chain link 1 and our opponent has used it as chain link 2. Regardless of what happens, you want to get that Phaedra out onto the board, and this is a very important step because at this point, no matter what our opponent does, you might be surprised to hear that we as the turn player will actually be in a much better spot at the end of all this than our opponent. After we've added the Phaedra with Kaiman and summoned it out onto the board, next our opponent's going to synchro summon into either the Meteor Burst Dragon, leaving Phaedra out onto the board, or they're going to synchro summon out into Transcendent Dragon to force all our monsters to attack. I think that realistically, these are the 2 options that your opponent can go for. Yes, they can make Bident and then Bident try to climb up into something else, but then if they do Bident, then they're allowing you to gain more advantage by synchroing off into your own Bident, bringing something back, and then getting a Phaedra effect on top of that, just essentially generating you an extra body throughout the whole process. So I feel like most Tenpai players will probably just go for either one of these 2, and I think that this is probably the best they actually can do at the moment. If they try to summon anything else, you can simply just summon a Meteor Burst Dragon, and then whatever they summon can't trigger. So if they try to summon like Black Rose Moonlight or Kui Belt or something, it just wouldn't work. So I think realistically, these are the only 2 options that your Tenpai opponent can go for. In this case, we're going to assume our opponent goes for a Transcendent Dragon because I think that most Tenpai players will sort of tunnel vision into the fact that, oh, I can summon Transcendent Dragon, force my opponent's monsters to all crash into it, and then they might just all die, and my opponent can't do anything at all in the battle phase if they have something like droplets on top of this. So for this example, we'll assume our opponent summons out Transcendent Dragon as chain link 2, and then we're going to resolve our chain link to synchro summon into a Bident Dragon. Regardless of whether our opponent went for Meteor Burst or Transcendent Dragon, you want to summon out Bident Dragon, and the reason we're doing that is because we're going to use its graveyard effect in main phase 2 to actually generate the extra bodies we need in order to break our opponent's board and set up a board of our own. The reason it was important to get Phaedra out onto the board was because if they make this play specifically and we're forced to crash, we can simply just attack with these 2 monsters and we should be in a good position. As you can see in the chat here, once we get into this situation, I as the turn player know for a fact I cannot kill my opponent because they have access to Transcendent Dragon already. So my goal is to somehow clear this Transcendent Dragon and then set up something that doesn't lose to their Sangen Kaiman during the next turn. And the opponent in this situation, their goal is just to survive, because if they didn't make this play like I mentioned in those earlier cases, they would simply just lose if they try to make something else. So now their goal is to make something like this, force me as the turn player to expend as many of my resources as possible in order to try to out this. Because if I don't out this, then during the next turn, it's going to OTK me with their known starter in hand. So at this point, we're going to just simply attack with the Bident Dragon and Phaedra because we're forced to by Transcendent. Doesn't matter if we take damage because our monsters stay alive thanks to Phaedra. And that was why it was so important to summon Phaedra, because now we get to keep both the bodies out onto the board. And then we'll proceed to main phase 2. And this is where you can take full advantage of the fact that you as the turn player have a main phase 2 to make link plays, whereas your opponent doesn't have access to anything outside the battle phase essentially on your turn, making it so you can do plays like linking off your Phaedra and your Bident Dragon into a copy of Hida, and then Hida, you can take their Phaedra from their graveyard. And then since Phaedra's effect wasn't used this turn, you can use this effect to bring something back out onto the field. And in this case, you want to bring back the Phaedra because you will be using the Biden Dragon to synchro summon later on, and you want to keep their Fadra on your board specifically, because when you steal their Fadra, you not only make it so you give your board protection through its own effect, but you also take away a resource from them because most Tenpai lists are only playing one. So taking their Fadra here is very important and accomplishes not only extending your own combo, but also taking away a key resource from your opponent. Since 3 or more attacks have been declared, we can use Biden Dragon to summon itself back out onto the board, pop a spell or trap if our opponent has one, and from here we will simply synchro away the Biden Dragon and the Pydra into a copy of our own Transcendent Dragon. And just a note, we aren't locked out of summoning Hida because we didn't get to use the Biden Dragon effect, so we are able to make this play even though we summoned Biden earlier on in our turn. So at this point, once we have our own Transcendent out onto the board, we're going to make a play where we simply just link away our Hida and our Transcendent into a copy of SP Little Knight. So SP Little Knight is huge here because it clears away the Transcendent Dragon. If you remember, this was one of our goals when we recognized that we couldn't OTK our opponent during the battle phase. We wanted to clear out our opponent's Transcendent Dragon and make sure they don't have access to it, because if they have access to it, then it's going to be very hard for us to protect ourselves from dying during their turn, even if we have their Fadra on our field. So after clearing their Transcendent Dragon, our next goal is to set up something that makes it so we don't lose to a single copy of Kaiman. And very simply, what we can do is just activate the effect of Transcendent Dragon in the graveyard. Since 3 or more attacks have been declared this turn, we can bring it back, and now we put our opponent in a position where they have to deal with Transcendent Dragon before they go into the battle phase. So now in this position, you can see that we now have something that is able to deal with their known starter for the next turn. They somehow need to clear a Fadra and a Transcendent from my board, otherwise I have OTK on the next turn. So you can see that even though we were in a tough situation where we only had a single Chandra and our opponent ended up having more bodies than we did, we were able to actually navigate the situation so that now we put our opponent in a tough spot to where even though we weren't able to OTK them, they now have to find a way to clear our board. Otherwise, they lose on the next turn. I wanted to show this situation not because it's something you'll come across every game as a Tenpai player. I wanted to share some key ideas to think about when you're the Tenpai player and you recognize that you can't OTK your opponent. So in cases outside the Tenpai mirror where this could be applicable, you could be in a Yubel matchup where your Yubel opponent has like Spirit of Yubel on the board plus like a regular Yubel or something, and you just can't out it during the battle phase to kill them. This is something you could consider doing. Essentially just thinking about, I can't OTK them, so now my goal should be to clear as many of their resources as possible and set up as much as I can during my main phase 2 to protect myself from dying so I can try OTKing them again on the next turn.
In this final section, I just wanted to go over a few things to keep track of when you're playing against Tenpai. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is Genroku being the additional tuner that Tenpai is able to access. A fairly common card that you'll see is the Black Goat Laughs, and against Tenpai, the Black Goat Laughs is always going to call Tenpai Dragon Chandra, and that essentially means if they're not able to bring it out onto the board, they won't have access to a tuner, and they won't be able to OTK or set up their synchro plays. That's where Genroku comes in. Whenever Genroku's added off of Kaiman or Song and Summoning, it's able to special summon itself as a level 4 tuner. So that's something important to keep track of both as a Tenpai player and going up against them. If you're playing Tenpai and get shut out on your Chandra with something like Black Goat Laughs or Crossout Designator in the mirror match, you will just then have to prioritize going into Kaiman or Song and Summoning to grab out Genroku for tuner access. Now, if you're playing against Tenpai and you shut out Chandra somehow, all you need to do then is stop their spell cards from searching out Genroku, making it so that Genroku won't ever be able to hit the field as a tuner monster, and then they won't ever get access to a tuner and thus won't be able to OTK you. One more thing about this card is it does Dragon Lock only when you use its effect to special summon from deck. Something pretty obvious you'll get just by reading the card, but I've seen so many people forget that. As the Tenpai player, you can't go into utility extra deck monsters like Samurai Destroyer, for example, and when you're playing against Tenpai, once they're Dragon Locked, you know they won't be able to access the part of their extra deck that isn't Dragon. So things like Link monsters like SP Little Knight or Hida or Promethean or things like that. So that's just something important for you to remember. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about is keeping track of how many Tenpai Dragon Fadras your opponent has gone through. In most lists I've seen, 1 is the standard ratio of Fadra that Tenpai Dragon players are going to play, and I personally think that this is the correct ratio. I've seen people play 2, I don't think it comes up enough, but when you're playing against Tenpai, you can essentially always assume that they're on 1 Fadra. And once they lose their Fadra, you know that their Chandra is now unable to summon it from the deck. Why that's important is because when the smaller Tenpais are trying to swing into bigger monsters, they need to bring out this card so that their monsters don't die and allow them to keep swinging into monsters to be able to build up a board full of dragons in order to synchro. But if they don't have access to Fadra in their deck, they can only summon Pydra, and Pydra is not going to prevent Chandra from being destroyed by battle when it crashes into something big, and that essentially just takes away a few bodies from them to synchro with. That's very important to remember because you can adjust your plays accordingly, knowing that if they try to crash into your bigger monster, they're unlikely to have their Chandra survive. On that note as well, if you're playing a fire deck against Tenpai, something you can do is actually steal their Fadra and hold it on your side of the board. Your opponent doesn't have access to bring it back with something like Biden Dragon. And this is very good because Fadra alone as a card grants them 2 extra bodies and it gives them an instant synchro right there. But if you take it, not only do they lose access to the additional bodies given by Fadra, it's now an extra thing they have to deal with that's very annoying for them because they can't be destroyed in battle. They can make Transcendent Dragon, switch it to attack, and keep swinging over it. It's very hard for you to die when you have this on your board, and it'll force them to go out of their way to out it with something like Black Rose Moonlight Dragon or Samurai Destroyer. So that's going to do it for this video. Let me know if you think I missed anything important. Once again, this guide isn't meant to teach you the basics of Tenpai. You can find that everywhere else on YouTube, but I just wanted to go over a few things that have come up a lot for me when I've been playing this deck, and I felt could be beneficial both for people playing the deck and trying to get better with it, as well as people playing against the deck, so they now have a better idea of some of the more intricate things that Tenpai can do that maybe the average Tenpai player wouldn't normally do. So once again, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and with all that being said, I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.